Hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm really delighted to be here to introduce this talk this evening. So to business then, let me introduce today's speaker. I'm delighted to introduce William Schniedewind, who is Professor of Biblical Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he was the inaugural holder of the Kershaw Chair of Ancient Eastern Mediterranean Studies. And he's the author of many books, including How the Bible Became a Book from Cambridge University Press, Social History of the Bible, Its Origins Through the Rabbinic Period from Yale, The Finger of the Scribe, How Scribes Learned to Write the Bible from Oxford University Press, among many others. Today, he'll be telling us about the communities of scribes who wrote the Bible. So at this point, handing over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, thank you for the invitation to share some highlights of my forthcoming book. Actually, I have physical copies, so I feel like it's not forthcoming anymore, but it's still a couple more days until it's officially released. The title is Who Really Wrote the Bible? The Story of the Scribes. I wrote this book to explore a different model for the authorship of biblical literature, or more precisely, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. It's an approach that works toward incorporating archaeology and inscriptions into our reading of and interpretation of biblical literature. Now, to be clear, I do not use archaeology or inscriptions to prove or disprove the Bible. Indeed, I don't think of the Bible as being in need of an apologetic, but it is a book that needs context. And I think the question, who really wrote the Bible, cannot be answered from a purely internal study of biblical literature. It requires the external context and control provided by archaeology, by inscriptions, as well as some anthropological theory. And this is what I've tried to do in writing Who Really Wrote the Bible and into trying to tell the story of the scribes. In researching aspects of ancient scribes for the past decade, it has become increasingly clear to me that scribes learned in small professional communities through apprenticeship. This is something that has been widely recognized, though not well developed in the literature. For this reason, I emphasize communities as opposed to individuals. I don't mean to completely dismiss individual authors, and sometimes they do appear in biblical literature. But we need to acknowledge that scribal communities created through apprenticeship learning are the primary location for the creation, preservation, and transmission of ancient Israelite religion. Once we recognize apprenticeship as the way scribes learn to read and write, we can ask the question, what does it mean? What are the implications? What's the nature of apprenticeship learning? How do scribes as communities, as opposed to individual authors, change the way we think about biblical literature? How does contextualizing writing as a skill used for different professions, as opposed to being a profession itself, change the way we view the formation of biblical literature? Finally, what are some of the professional communities that can contribute to biblical literature? If we want to understand the creation and transmission of biblical literature, we need to think practically. I think we need to think practically about the locations where scribes actually worked, how they learned, how they developed relationships, the masters and their apprenticeships that created these communities of practice. So let's take a look for a moment at how I organized my book. Here's the table of contents. You can see, if you look carefully, that I've organized it historically. I begin with part 1, creating the Hebrew scribal community, which happens in the early Iron Age. In that period, scribalism tends to be very narrow, related to the government. And then there's part 2, scribal communities of the Bible in the late Iron Age. This is a period in which there are new social classes and professions that begin to use writing. And finally, I move to the exile and beyond in part 3. A scribal community survives, but barely. It barely survives, I would argue. And Hebrew writing in this last period is centered on the temple and mostly among the priests in the post-exilic period. So those are the general, that's the general historical orientation. Let me look for a moment at some of the different chapters here. I focus on professions and organize the chapters around professions. These professions there are a variety of them. They include government scribes, military scribes, prophets, merchants, and priests. So for example, Ezra is a priest and a scribe, but priest was Ezra's profession. Scribe was a skill, his training. It wasn't his profession. Priestly scribes were a community that, for example, extended from the First Temple period into the Second Temple period, but it includes both the Jerusalem priests and priests from the peripheral locations. Priests like Ezekiel, for example, were originally affiliated with the Jerusalem temple, but priests like Jeremiah were peripheral to the Jerusalem temple. My emphasis on scribes is also to distinguish it from author. There's an unfortunate tendency among modern readers to conflate scribe with our modern author. And a scribe is not another word for author. An author creates a tradition. A scribe passes on a tradition created by a scribal community. Now, let me digress for a moment here and make the point, and ask the question, when did scribes actually become a profession? This happens only in the Hellenistic and the Roman period, when scribes actually become a profession, and then authorship becomes really important. That's outside the scope of my book, really, in some fundamental ways. I talk about it a little bit in an introduction. I mention it in the conclusion, but my book is going to focus on the scribal communities in this period in which scribe is part of a community and a tradition, not an individual. Okay. Now, for the purposes of lecture today, or talk today, I just want to really focus on three things. One, make an argument for scribes and their communities of practice from the inscriptional record, from archaeology, as well as some biblical texts. And I want to illustrate this, the evidence also for government and military scribes, as well as a prophetic scribal community. And then for the rest of it, you have to read the book, okay? Okay. Now, to begin with, this book really kind of spins out of a book I wrote published in 2019 that was published by Oxford, called The Finger of the Scribe: How Scribes Learned to Write the Bible. This was a book about scribal curriculum, and I think I made some revolutionary advances in our understanding of ancient Israelite curriculum. But it was when I was writing this book that I began to reflect on the apprenticeship system of education. My appreciation for the importance of apprenticeship was also furthered by anthropological research, particularly books by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, as well as a later book edited by my UCLA colleague, Willeke Vendrich, on archaeology and apprenticeship. In their book, Situated Learning, Lave and Wenger explore how social networks that they call communities of practice are created by apprenticeship. They use case studies drawn from craft guilds like tailors and butchers and midwives, and this research was developed specifically in an ancient Near Eastern context by Vendrich's edited volume. Ancient craftspeople also learned a variety of skills through apprenticeship, and this included pottery, metalsmithing, as well as reading and writing. Now, what are the implications of this model? This type of learning creates long-lasting, close-knit social networks. That is to say, the communities of practice. These communities are defined by three characteristics. First of all, a shared domain, and this would be their profession. It could be a metalsmith, it could be a priest, it could be a soldier, it could be a prophet, or even a merchant. Second, there were professions create close-knit communities. And finally, these professions have a practice, that is the skills of their profession or trade. The purpose of this community of practice is to replicate the master and to learn to reproduce the tradition, not to reinvent it. And that's worth repeating. The purpose is not to reinvent the tradition. The purpose is to replicate the tradition. Now, let me turn to some examples of these communities of practice in the Hebrew Bible. First, familial language. Learning environments like this create close-knit communities that use familial language. Scribes become a family, both in realia and also fictively. The nature of apprenticeship meant that a master took on apprentices that were referred to as sons. Apprentices included both the master's own family, but also people who were outside the family who became part of a fictive kin group. The familial nature of ancient apprenticeship learning is reflected in the biblical use of terms like banim for sons and yeladim for children to refer to communities of crass people and scribes. And here are just a few examples of these kind of things in biblical literature. In some contexts, like the Book of Chronicles, the term sons could even be translated as a guild. In other contexts, like Nehemiah, it's clear that the word is used for a guild of goldsmiths. In 2 Kings, the term refers to a guild of prophets. I'll look at this example a little more closely a bit later, but let's look at a couple of the examples of the word yeladim for children in 1 Kings and in Isaiah 8. Here's 1 Kings 12. It's the story of the division of the kingdom, and yeladim is usually translated as children, even though they're an adult group of royal advisors to Rehoboam. When the group of Israelites complain about high taxation and they threaten to divide the kingdom, Rehoboam takes counsel with the elders and the yeladim. These yeladim are Rehoboam's contemporaries, and Rehoboam was supposedly 40 years old when he came to the throne, so these yeladim were hardly children. Scholar Neely Fox has pointed out the similarity of yeladim to an Egyptian administrative group known as the children of Pharaoh's nursery. This was an administrative term referring to people who were raised and groomed for service within Pharaoh's administration. They were often foreigners. They worked in the sprawling Egyptian administrative centers in the Levant during the heyday of the empire. And given this background, the yeladim here likely represented younger people apprenticed for government service. In this respect, they represented government bureaucracy over against the traditional social structures represented by the elders. Another interesting example is in the book of Isaiah, where the prophet equates the term yeladim or children with limudim, which can be translated as students or maybe disciples. Here I'm treating verses 16 through 18 as a unit, as Hugh Williamson notes. Most scholars assume these verses are written as a single unit, even though there's no necessarily syntactic a connection between verses 16 and 17 and verse 18. Even so, I still think verse 18 has to be interpreted as relating to verses 16 and 17. And this would raise the question about the relationship between the disciples who are sealing the teaching and Isaiah's children. In my opinion, it follows that the disciples and the children are one and the same group. Isaiah equates the term yeladim with limudim, that is, with children with students or disciples. In this passage, the prophet is asking his apprentices to collect his oracles, that is, to bind up the testimony and seal the teaching. And then Isaiah continues and uses the term yeladim for these same students. See, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts. I think the verse 18 identifies my students with the children that God gave to Isaiah, that is, the apprentices of the prophet. And this is the natural expression of apprenticeship learning. They are the sons of the prophets, or we would call them a prophetic guild. Now, let's look at a few examples in the inscriptional record for apprenticeship. Let me begin with some evidence from a place called Kentillet Ajrud, where we have soldiers learning to read and write. The fortress of Qohelet stands on a high hill overlooking a trade route through the desert from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Here's the route. Here's an artist reconstruction of the fortress. This is one of the illustrations for the book. And so if you like pictures, this is a great book, because this is one of the 51 illustrations in the book. The arid location of the site meant that we get really wonderful preservation of inscriptions that were published recently in a monograph by Zev Meshel. Now let's take a look at some of these inscriptions. Here's a few examples. There are several types of inscriptions that are found at the site. The image on the left is an example of one of the plaster wall inscriptions. The jar on the right-hand side has an inscription, Lesar Ir, that I would translate as belonging to the fortress commander. It's actually one of 5 inscriptions at the site that mention the fortress commander. And then the jar in the middle is one of 2 big storage jars that had a wide variety of scribal exercises that I wrote about in my previous book. Let's take a quick look at this middle jar to illustrate a master and apprentice's learning. Okay. This is a projection drawing of the middle jar with some of the exercises on the inscription. There are several different kinds of exercises. I wrote about them in the Finger of the Scribes. There are lists of names. There are letter practicing. You have practicing the letters. They have a letter templates, practicing how to write personal letters. On the right-hand side, there are abecediaries. There are also vocabulary lists. So you have a whole variety of different things. And then here's another letter template right here on the right-hand side. And if we take a closer look, we can actually see the master and the apprentice at work. So here, look at on the right-hand side, this example. The master writes in red ink with an elegant flowing hand, and the apprentice writes in black ink in a much less accomplished hand. So you can see the use of red ink for a teacher isn't just a modern convention. This is actually something that we know about quite well in ancient Israel, but also especially in ancient Egypt. You can also notice here, look carefully in the middle. In yellow, I have the letter shin or sh in Hebrew, which is written in a flowing hand like a W. But then above it, you see the apprentice writing, and he hasn't quite executed this letter. He writes the W like it's 2 V's, the shin letter like it's 2 V's instead of a W. So he's learning to write, and you can see the learning in the inscriptions. This is also, the learning is also illustrated in the plaster inscriptions, and I really like this example. There are a number of plaster wall inscriptions from Qohelet. These inscriptions were written on the walls of the fortress, and they were meant to be memorized by the soldiers who were stationed there and learning to read and write. And the really interesting part is the top right-hand side, which seems to be a title. And here I'm building on a reconstruction of Professor Erhard Bloom, but I would place the title here at the top right here. And the title is really interesting. And probably reflects its purpose. It would be translated as "For or the apprentices of the fortress commander." Strange title for an inscription here, but it tells you what's happening. These are the apprentices that are reading and memorizing these texts as part of their scribal training. And this kind of scribal training is really nicely illustrated in a book by David Carr called Writing on the Tablet of the Heart. The word here for apprentices is really interesting as the title. It can be found in a variety of other inscriptions, and I'm not going to look at them all, but let's just look at a couple. The use of the title is found on a number of seal impressions. Here, for example, W.F. Albright excavated 4 seal impressions at a place called Tel Beit Mirsam with the inscription belonging to Eliakim, the apprentice, or Na'ar, of Yao Khan. On the left, you see the drawing of these seal impressions. More recently, salvage excavations at the site of Tel Beit Mirsam recovered another seal impression on a jar handle that was impressed with the very same seal. From these examples, it becomes clear that the Hebrew word na'ar is a title for apprentices, and not just junior people, but people who are older. It's not clear what this person's particular profession is, but it seems likely that they're related to government administration. These seal impressions also give me the opportunity to do a digression, which I really, really interesting digression into these names. In the inscriptional record, you have the letters in Hebrew Yod, Vav, or YW, pronounced Yao, that are used for personal names for people from the northern kingdom of Israel. In contrast, the prefix YHW or Isaiah or Jehoshaphat are used as prefix and suffixes for people who come from the southern kingdom of Judah. So this would mark, these seal impressions would be from a northern refugee. And the question is like, what is this northern refugee doing in the south, in Judah? I think this is evidence for refugees who came from the north down to the south and began living in Judah after the Assyrians destroyed Samaria in 721 BC. These seal impressions give tangible evidence for one refugee, and this is important for telling the story of the scribes who produced the Bible. Why? Because here are a couple chapters where I talk about the northern kingdom and the influence. There are a lot of northern texts in the Hebrew Bible. Consider for a minute that much of the biblical literature in the Pentateuch, for example, or in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, deal with northern tribes. But the north was destroyed in 721 BC. So how do their stories get to Jerusalem? I trace these scribal communities in the inscriptional and archaeological records in a couple chapters, and it's a really interesting story. Let me give you just one more fascinating example, maybe two. There are 14 seal impressions that belong to a person by the name of Menachem, the son of Yaubana, who comes from Samaria. You have 9 seal impressions, number 1, from the first seal that read, belonging to Menachem, the son of Yaubana. Now, Menachem is a really well-known northern name. In fact, it was one of the name of one of the last northern kings. And his father's name, Yaubana, with the YW prefix, identifies him as an Israeli refugee in Jerusalem. This is where it becomes interesting. Look at seal number 2, belonging to Menachem, the son of Yobana. The Yao is missing from the prefix now, and just replaced by an ambiguous Yod or Y. No identity is marked in this seal. It gets even more interesting when we look at the third seal impression, which it says, I'm translating it, belonging to Menachem, the son of Yehobana. But look what they did in this seal on the right-hand side, you see in the red. They squeezed in 2 letters after the seal was cut that marks his identity as Judean as opposed to Israeli or northern, right? He's negotiating his identity in this development of these different seal impressions, which is a very natural phenomenon for immigrants and refugees. And you see it sort of illustrated here. Now, this gives me the opportunity to give one more digression of really an interesting piece of evidence. And this is another chapter of the book where I want to talk about women in the Hebrew Bible and the authors. Women, and I include them as part of the professions. And this is a seal here you see at the bottom, belonging to Hami Ochel, the daughter of Menachem. This is probably the daughter of Menachem, who trained his daughter of Menachem, who trained his daughter as a scribe. And the fish is probably a representative of something that had to do with her profession. The seal is really interesting. It was excavated in a tomb just outside the city of Jerusalem. And here I am a couple years ago, sort of giving an explanation of these tombs. I think these are tombs of Israeli refugees who migrated to Jerusalem after 721 and settled, and carved these tombs just outside the city. And this seal was found there and gives us a glimpse into the larger story of some of the women scribes and writing by women in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, I've digressed enough. Let me get back to my main point here. I was talking about apprenticeships, and let me give you just one more example of another set of inscriptions. These are inscriptions from a place called Arad, in a fortress in the south of Judah. And there's a temple there with storage rooms, and there are lists of personal names. And in these lists of personal names, we have, again, the word na'ar or apprentice used again and again in these lists. This is just one example. There are a couple other examples at Arad again. It further illustrates literacy in the military profession, but Arad also illustrates literacy in the priestly profession, because there are a number of inscriptions that are found in this temple complex at Arad, peripheral priests that are writing and keeping records. Okay. So, apprentices. Let's go in to a passage in the Bible and look at apprenticeship communities among the prophets. Here I'm looking at 2 Kings chapter 9, and we have the story of Elisha, who calls one of the sons of the prophets and says, "Go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, look there for Jehu, the son of Nimshi. Take a flask of oil, pour it on his head, and then, thus anoint him and say, 'Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel.'" So the apprentice, the na'ar of the prophet, goes to Ramoth Gilead and he anoints them. So you get the combination of the word son, or the sons of the prophet, and the word apprentice here put together nicely. It reminds me of a passage in Amos, a famous passage where Amos claims to be not a prophet, or the, quote, son of a prophet. I think he's claiming that he's not an apprentice or part of the prophetic guild. Now, this is really interesting because remarkably, some background for this prophetic guild related to Elisha has been excavated at Tel Rehov by Ami Mazar. This is an ostrakhan, or it's not an ostrakhan, it's probably a wall plaque that was excavated there with the name Elisha on it. There are a number of things that are really interesting about this. The reason I want to call it a wall plaque instead of an ostrakhan is a broken pottery sherd. That's what we always find, is broken pottery sherds with writing on them. But look at the shape of this. This is not a broken piece of pottery. Somebody shaped it, rounded it, and then what else did they do? They wrote on it with red ink, which is really, really unusual, and the letters are actually much larger than normal. And it seems like this was probably placed on a wall in Elisha's house. And this is a artist's reconstruction of a building that Ami Mazar excavated at Tel Rehov. And you can see I had the artist draw a little wall plaque on the back of the building where the inscription was found. But the interesting thing about this building is not a normal building. It has like two entrances. It goes in this circular motion. There are all kinds of cultic objects that were found in the building. It's not a normal building. Something strange is going on here. Indeed, it's not a temple though, because it doesn't have all the things of a temple. So something strange is going on here. Ami Mazar actually suggested that this whole area around the building was a quarter for the sons of the prophets, that is, for a prophetic guild. And it's noteworthy that 3 other inscriptions were found in this quarter, including 2 inscriptions that read belonging to Nimshi. Now, who is Nimshi? Nimshi is the son is Jehu's father. That's mentioned in the Elijah-Elisha narratives. And so the juxtaposition of the Elisha inscription with the Nimshi's inscriptions in this quarter, and there are other inscriptions that were found here, suggests that this may have been the area where the sons of the prophets actually lived. Okay, let me move on. Is there more evidence for a prophetic guild? Well, I think so. At a place called Lachish, they excavated 2 seal impressions, which have in their third line probably the title "son of a prophet." At least that was the way Aharoni, Yohanan Aharoni, interpreted it when he excavated it in the 1960s. And here you see my composite drawing of the 2 seal impressions. It has 3 registers, and Aharoni wants to read the 3rd register as the title of this person, Jeremiah, the son of Zephaniah. Now, some scholars would suggest that we don't read it as the son of a prophet, but we read it as the son of a person named Nobi, which would be an absolutely meaningless Hebrew word. I don't agree with this, partly because they haven't taken into full appreciation the archaeological context of this particular find. Unfortunately, this is very typical of people reading inscriptions where we don't ask, like, well, where was it found and what was the context of it? In this case, the archaeological context is really interesting. It was found in a jar with 17 other seal impressions or bullae. And in this collection of seal impressions, there are other administrative titles, such as royal steward, servant of the king, son of the king. And in the same archaeological locus, Aharoni excavated inscribed weights, as well as an administrative ostracon known as Lachish number 22. In this case, I still think it's best to understand Ben Navi here as the title of this person, in Jeremiah, the son of Zephaniah, and it fits into a nice idea of apprenticeships within the prophetic scribal community. All right, so let me conclude with I think one of the best illustrations of apprenticeship community, and that comes from the Ophel in Jerusalem. In the excavations of Alat Mazar, she excavated 34 seal impressions in the Ophel, just north of the city of David, in front of the Temple Mount. And there are 7 seal impressions belonging to someone called the son of Bess. And there are 2 seal impressions with royal insignia, and there are 2 seal impressions reflecting a prophetic scribal community, as I'll get to in a moment. But let's talk about these 7 seal impressions of the son of Bess. So here's my composite drawing on the left-hand side of seal impressions B2, B3, and B4. They were all struck with the same seal. And then there are other seal impressions, B5, 6, 7, and 8, that are from different seals. All 7 seals have the son of Bess in their 3rd register. So as a group, they represent 5 different individuals on 7 seal impressions. And this impression provides a typology for the whole group. That is, they all have 3 registers. Each register is separated by a double line. Each word is separated by a vertical line. So we can posit that there are 3 generations of a fictive kinship group, all going back to Bess, a community of practice with Bess as the patriarch. The Bess cache is especially important because we know something of its broader archaeological context. The Ophel area of Jerusalem was a royal administrative area between the city of David and the Temple Mount, and the Bess community represents a community working in the administrative area. Now, more evidence for apprenticeships in this group can be maybe reflected in the famous Isaiah seal impression, which seems to use the title prophet. Now, this was excavated with the Bess group, right? And there has been some argument about whether the proper reading and reconstruction is Isaiah the prophet, as Alat Mazar suggested. I think that she is basically correct for a number of reasons that I discuss at length in the book. But let me make a couple points here related specifically to the discussion of apprenticeship. To begin with, it's unfortunate that we emphasize the importance of excavated finds as opposed to antiquities market purchases, and then fail to consider the archaeological context in our interpretations. The advantage of an excavated find is not just that it puts to rest the question of authenticity. Archaeological context provides the historical context for reading an artifact. In this case, it's more than a stroke of luck or fate or coincidence that the Isaiah seal impression was found 10 feet away from a seal impression of Hezekiah, the king of Judah. It reflects the general archaeological context of the Ophel, which housed administrative buildings as well as the royal palace. Moreover, the name Isaiah was also very uncommon in Jerusalem during the Iron Age. And Alat Mazar actually misrepresents this when she writes, quote, "The name Yeshayahu, or Isaiah, was very common and appears on 30 seals and bullae." In point of fact, this observation is based entirely on items purchased on the antiquities market. Were there really many people named Isaiah in the late 8th century in Jerusalem? Based on the excavated inscriptural record, absolutely not. Before Alat Mazar's excavations, the name Isaiah had never ever appeared in an excavated epigraphic inscription. So for example, as a control, consider the seal impressions excavated in the city of David by Yigal Shiloh. There are 85 readable names on the published seals, and the name Isaiah never ever appears. So on the basis of controlled excavated finds, where we find hundreds and hundreds of names and never Isaiah, one must conclude that the name Isaiah was not common. So this is probably our Isaiah of the Bible. Okay, it's more interesting than that. Mazar actually found another seal impression that I would read as belonging to Iddo-Yahu, the son of Isaiah. This becomes the second mention of the name Isaiah from a controlled excavation. But who is this Iddo-Yahu, and what is his relationship to the Isaiah of the other seal? As I pointed out with regard to the sons of Beth's seal impressions, familial relationships are represented in this cache, right? And this reflects the familial nature of professions, with the fathers training sons as well as apprentices. It opens up a possibility that this seal actually belonged to Isaiah's son or his apprentice. Let's look a little more closely at this name, Iddo-Yahu. It comes from the root ayin dalet dalet, which we find actually quite frequently in the Bible. It means to declare or to witness. It's used for several prophets in the Hebrew Bible. It's also known from the Aramaic Zakor inscription. This is item number 5 in this list. It makes the relationship between Isaiah and the Iddo-Yahu seal impressions even more interesting, given the fact that the name Isaiah had not appeared elsewhere. And the most plausible explanation is that the seal of Iddo-Yahu belonged to the son or the apprentice of the very Isaiah known from the other seal impression. In this interpretation, the prophet Isaiah's apprentice very appropriately has a name related to the prophetic profession. And the title Navi for prophet becomes a very interesting term that should make us rethink the semantic development in biblical literature. And that's something I do in the book, but you have to read the book. Later, scribes are going to reinvent this title and reuse it more broadly. Okay. And that also points us back to this text I began with, right? You know, bind up the testimony and seal the teaching among my students, right? See, I and the children whom the Lord has given me. These two seal impressions of Isaiah and Iddo-Yahu, alongside the best seal impressions, provide further archaeological evidence for apprenticeship relationships in the epigraphic record. For me, they highlight how the integration of archaeology and inscriptions with the reading of biblical text can yield a deeper and richer interpretation. Okay, to conclude, what are the implications of the method? Well, first, I suggest that the answer to this question must begin with the apprenticeship learning model for understanding scribal communities that created, collected, and preserved the Hebrew Bible. Apprenticeships created a closely knit fictive kinship groups that use familial language to reflect their communities. Second, the writing was learned for professions such as palace scribes, military scribes, temple scribes, prophets, and so on. Third, I would suggest that each profession had its own distinct scribal community. This is why we can identify the language of P or the priestly source in biblical literature. They're not schools, they are communities of practice related to professions and groups created by small group learning in the apprenticeship setting. Each community had its own sociolect, that means spelling, paleography, lexicon, and so on. Although much was undoubtedly shared, there would have been distinctions as well. And finally, this would mean that there was no national Hebrew script because writing was not centralized. It was decentralized in a variety of scribal communities related to different professions. And these professions were the scribal communities that wrote, collected, and preserved biblical literature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can come in there. Thanks very much, Bill. That was a really tremendous talk. It was rich, it was detailed, immensely learned across material, archaeological, linguistic, and intellectual history. So can I please at this point encourage questions in our Q&A. Do feel free to pitch your question wherever is appropriate, whether it's expert or whether it's inexpert, whether it's focused on the subject or whether it's a more general kind of question. We have one question here in the Q&A to start us off. So I'll begin with this one, if I can, Bill. And it's a question, I think, that turns on the word who wrote the Bible. It turns on the issue of the authorship as well. So with this is from Hugh Bernays. With a title like Who Wrote the Bible, I was expecting to hear who composed the content we find in the Bible, like who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, at least which scribe who came across the story and assimilated it. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, and this is the subtitle is really important here, right? The story of the scribes. So I'm telling the story of the people who wrote the Bible, not, and part of that story, of course, like when I'm talking about Isaiah and the prophets, I'm making comments about the formation of biblical literature. How does the book of Isaiah get written? I will argue that it's mostly through the community of Isaiah, not the individual of Isaiah. Although sometimes you see Isaiah come out in the book. So for example, in chapter 6, you hear the first person voice of the prophet, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, right? And you have a couple of chapters where the first person voice is there. But the book in general begins, these are the visions of Isaiah. It's told in third person, told, I would say, by the community of scribes. And I'm trying to, discover those people, those scribes, and tell the stories of the scribes. It means that the book isn't like some books, which would say Genesis is written by Moses and Exodus is written by, Aaron or whatever, and I'm not going through verse by verse of the Bible and telling you who wrote it, but I am talking about, in general, I'm talking about the scribes and their stories and the different communities and attaching different kinds of literature to those different scribes. So I do talk about, authorship, but I'm more interested in the people as opposed to, like, I would say in some ways the less interesting question of like who's the author of this particular text.
Thank you. I'll come on to the second question if I can. addressing a question of linguistic flux. Thank you very much for this interesting topic, Professor. Scribes are indeed the backbone for all religions to have credible claims. My question is this: why do Christians not keep the original scripture, just like Muslims, to prevent loss of meaning over time as languages change meaning over time? Doesn't the true meaning become more and more diluted with each translation?
Well, that is an interesting philosophical question. The question, of course, is put to me once by one of my professors of philosophy as, do you think that the meaning is in the message or in the manuscript, right? Do you think that that translation fundamentally dilutes? And I probably would say, I think it dilutes some of the aesthetics. I think that sometimes you don't see some of the nuances that are richer in the original languages, but I think good translations capture the message. So I don't really agree with the premise that that the true meaning becomes more and more diluted with each translation. In fact, each translation gives new nuances and new depth and breadth to the original text.
Thank you very much for that. We have a few other questions. I'm going to put them to you as they come in that order, and we'll see how far we get with them. A question then from that question, by the way, that last one was from Ahmed Karakuk. This one is from Vivian McAllister. Is there evidence for schools where scribes were trained? Is there evidence for groups of scribes working together in the manner later used by Christian scribes in monasteries?
No, there isn't really evidence in the same way. What it looks like is that it's much more like an apprenticeship model, or in some ways I would say homeschooling. If you think about it, instead of institutionalized schooling as opposed to homeschooling where you're sitting there. Now you're teaching your own children, but often in homeschooling you say, oh, my neighbor his kids are coming over and I'm teaching them English, and Kevin would be a good person because he's an English professor. And then you say, oh, but we're going to send them to our other neighborhood who's a science professor, and he's going to do the homeschooling in biology, right? So it looks like it's much more in terms of a model like homeschooling as opposed to public institutions. And it has to, you think about apprenticeship learning, that's the way apprenticeship learning works.
That's great. That's great. Thanks. Send them to the science. I say that's my conclusion now. Okay, next question then. Where do you think the source material for the scribal writing of the Pentateuch comes from? Were they modifying J and E? And you might want to explain J and E for the broad audience we have here.
Yeah, so one of the major theories of composition of the Pentateuch is that there are four sources: a Yahwist, an Elohist, a priestly source, and a Deuteronomic source. In some ways, this book doesn't take aim at that model. It's an old model related to Julius Wellhausen and 19th century scholarship. But in some ways it does, because that model has sort of tended to look at authors as opposed to communities. Although the original idea of the documentary hypothesis, as they call it, did have some accounting for communities that developed the documents. I'm not looking at the problem, I'm not taking on this problem directly, but I am sort of emphasizing that the material comes out of different communities. So for example, I think that D comes out of a group called the People of the Land, who were a rural elder group. I think that the Holiness Code comes out of the peripheral priestly community. probably, but most of this stuff probably is getting first written down in the late 8th century. So that, but the materials go back much earlier, and some of the oral materials may go back to the early Iron Age, you know, the 12th, 11th, 10th century. And then as soon as you have scribes, you have the need to write and create curriculum. And I think that, you know, that's why I wrote my previous book about curriculum, is because I think we underestimate the importance of curriculum in the formation of the biblical record. So, for example, the question mentions the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh was part of the scribal curriculum of Mesopotamia. So scribes, when they were learning to read and write in cuneiform, they would have learned and memorized parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the same way, I think a lot of parts of biblical literature used to be scribal curriculum for different communities: peripheral priests, central priests, government workers, military, you know, different things. And those are questions I develop and explore in the book.
Thank you for that. That question was from Elishiva Salamo. The next perhaps touches on what you've just been speaking about there from Tim Evans. Do you know if other non-Hebrew peoples, and I presume this means contemporary non-Hebrew peoples, had a similar community of practice approach to scribal traditions and compiling their texts?
Well, I developed the model broadly in an ancient Near East context. So the model applies to ancient Egypt. It applies more generally in Mesopotamia. Those are the two places where so the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, those are the two contexts that we have really great, rich comparative evidence. The local, like let's say the Arameans and the Phoenicians and the Moabites, the evidence that we have is really much, much more meager. There are reasons to assume that they had similar models, and I could probably write another book on that, but we don't have really robust, as good evidence for those more local communities as we do have for cuneiform and hieroglyphs.
Thank you for that. This next question is pitched differently and bears perhaps on your own personal experience of doing this research. From I. Hughes, how does it feel when you're amongst the seals and inscriptions and to be so near the scribes who would create a lot of history to come?
Yeah, no, sometimes every once in a while you stand back and you realize, like, I'm touching history, like I'm moving back 2,000, 3,000 years and trying to recover this person who worked and wrote and, you know, contributed to some of the great, you know, literary works of Western civilization. So it's sometimes awe-inspiring. Sometimes you get so wrapped up in your work that you forget to sort of stand back and like realize, oh my goodness, you know, you're touching history every day.
Thanks for that. We have another question here from Stephen Smythe. I hope I've got your pronunciation right there. Does the observation that communities of scribes wrote the books of the Old Testament cast any light on how we might better understand the purposes of the Old Testament or the nature of each or various of the books? For example, history, myth, philosophy, prophecy, etc.
It doesn't, for me, it doesn't change things that much. I mean, I think one of the things that's important is there's a different model. It's a community model as opposed to an individual model. And the development of the individual model is a Hellenistic model, and we tend to sort of push it back into the ancient world. On the other hand, it's nice to think about texts as the products of a community. And in some ways, there are some texts that still do this. I mean, rabbinic midrash, for example, is unauthored work. It's not like, you know, when you're reading the Genesis Rabbah, this is, sometimes you have the voices of different rabbis, but in general, it's the collection of the community, not the individual person. The Greeks, especially in the Hellenistic period, really foisted the idea of authorship into the Jewish tradition. And it's in that point where you get the idea, well, who wrote Genesis, or who wrote different books of the Bible, and tries to answer that question. But the text, of course, but in the end, the text is the same. It doesn't really matter whether it was produced by a community or it was produced by an individual. It's still the other thing that's nice about a community, though. Here, let's say one other thing. The other thing that's nice about a community is the problem of authorship is you never know what an author was thinking, right? Because it's just the problem of authorial intent is very difficult, especially when I'm talking about antiquity. But if you're talking about a community, and let's say I'm talking about the peripheral priests, it's much easier in my estimation to understand the purposes of a community, a group, than it is to understand the mind of an individual. So I think that maybe it makes the text easier to understand, but it's an interesting question.
Can I just follow up on that, perhaps with the sort of comment that writing by committee has a very poor reputation subsequently, and it's a lovely argument to the contrary to focus on the communal productions. Writing by committee has a bad reputation, I would think, because it generally doesn't produce good aesthetics. Many of the books of the Bible clearly have a strong eye on their own beauty. So I'm just wondering about texts like the Book of Job, for example, with all its metaphorical density, or the Song of Songs, maybe, with its sort of intense dance.
Right. I mean, poetry, though, is interesting because poetry is a ritual text that, as opposed to narrative. And when you get to there are some texts in the Bible that are certainly works of art, parts of Isaiah, I'm a little less, I like the ideas of Job, but the language and the articulation of it is, in Hebrew especially, is a little more questionable as an aesthetic to me. But where you find problems in biblical literature is in the narrative, especially because this is where the documentary hypothesis arise. How do you understand the tensions in different kinds of texts and the incongruities? It's in the writing by committee, right, where you put things together. And that has its advantages, and I would still say it has its advantages and disadvantages. There's a historical element if you're interested in not just the aesthetics of the text, but also the historical aspects of the text. Then there's something to be gained in understanding in American English we say the house that Jack built, how it comes together.
Thank you very much for your talk, and also for your really generous full answers there. We are out of time now. By way of finishing, can I firstly remind you that there is a recording of this event which will be available on the festival's YouTube channel. This can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival, and if you've registered for this talk, you'll receive an email telling you when the video is available. I'd also just like to note that if you'd like to purchase a copy of William's book, Who Really Wrote the Bible, you can do so from the partner bookshop of the festival, the wonderful Fox Lane books in York. Finally, can I just thank you very much, Bill, for a really stimulating and engaging talk.
Thank you.